"You came back." Vivian Desmond's voice barely made it past the rain. Her wrists were bound overhead with wet cord, lashed to the iron beam of the estate's rear terrace, and the storm was coming down like it meant to drown the whole property. It was 5:12 in the morning. She'd stopped feeling her fingers 20 minutes ago. Standing in the lit doorway behind her, silk robe snapping in the wind, was Karen Willis, pointing, screaming something about a broken glass and about knowing her place. Karen didn't see him yet. But past the glass, past Karen's shoulder, in the shadow of the threshold, stood a man who was supposed to be 3,000 miles away in Seoul. Lee Han-soo, rain still clinging to the shoulders of his coat. He raised one gloved finger to his lips. "Quiet," he mouthed. Vivian's eyes went wide, and for a second the cold didn't matter at all. Because if Han-soo was standing there, if he'd been standing there long enough to hear Karen's voice climb into that register, then he already knew. He just hadn't decided yet whether to let Karen finish showing him who she really was. 4 days early. No warning, no driver, no call ahead. He'd come back the way a man comes back when he no longer trusts what he's being told over the phone. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who can't stand watching someone in power get lied to their face while the person paying the real price hangs there in the rain, drop where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because this one is about to get worse for Karen Willis long before it gets better for anyone else. But to understand how Vivian ended up hanging in that storm, you have to go back 3 days, to a gray Tuesday morning when none of this had happened yet, when the worst thing anyone in that house had to worry about was whether the roses out front needed trimming before the weekend. Vivian stood in the foyer with the rest of the staff that morning, hands folded the way Mrs. Bell had trained her years ago, watching Han-soo's black sedan roll down the long gravel drive toward the front gate. He hadn't said much on his way out, a nod to the driver, a word to Karen about checking in each evening, a glance back at the house that Vivian couldn't quite read. Powerful men rarely looked back. When they did, it usually meant something. Karen stood beside the door in a cream silk robe, waving with 2 fingers like she was posing for a magazine, her smile wide and warm for exactly as long as the car was still visible. The moment the gate closed behind it, the smile came off her face like a mask being peeled from wet skin. The car hadn't even cleared the gates before the smile died on her face. She turned around slowly. The staff was still standing there, waiting for the usual pleasant dismissal. "Thank you all, carry on, I'll be in my office." That wasn't what came. "Phones," Karen said instead. "All of them now." Nobody moved at first, certain they'd misheard her. "I said now." Her voice had dropped into a register none of them had heard from her before, not in 2 years of holiday parties and thank you cards and the careful graciousness she'd built her reputation on. "Mr. Lee is not here to babysit you, and I will not have this staff gossiping about this household to God knows who while he's gone." Mrs. Bell handed hers over first. Vivian watched something flicker across the older woman's face, the look of someone who'd seen this movie before and already knew how it ended. Vivian handed hers over last, eyes down, already doing the math. 4 days. Karen had never had this house to herself before. 4 days was a long runway for a woman who apparently had somewhere she wanted to fly. "Effective today," Karen went on, packing the marble in her slippers like she'd rehearsed it. "Breaks are 15 minutes, not 30. The East Wing is off limits after 8, and no personal calls from the house line for anyone." Daniel Cho, still carrying garden dirt on his knees, didn't say a word. He just looked at his hands. "Hand over your phones, or hand in your badges." That was the phrase she used when Mrs. Bell hesitated 1 second too long, not a request anymore, a transaction. Vivian had seen the difference before, in a different house, with a different woman, back when her mother was still alive and still believing decent people wouldn't let a hospital take everything they had. Decent people don't always stop it. Sometimes they don't even notice until it's over. She noticed now. She just didn't say anything yet. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Vivian sat in the small room off the pantry with a drugstore notebook she'd bought 2 years back and never had reason to use until now. She wrote down the time the phones were taken, the exact words about the East Wing. The mention Karen had made, in passing, to the household accountant, of restructuring compensation for efficiency, words that don't sound like anything decent when you say them plainly. She didn't know yet what it was building toward. She only knew the shape of it, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky tells you. Karen passed her in the hallway near midnight, wine glass in hand, humming under her breath like the day had gone exactly the way she wanted. "You're up late," Karen said, not really a question. "Just finishing the linens, ma'am," Vivian answered, eyes low. Karen smiled, private and satisfied, the smile of a woman who believes no one in the room is capable of seeing her clearly. "He thinks I'm his wife," she said, mostly to the wine glass. "But by the time he's back, this house is going to know exactly who's actually in charge of it." She walked on, without looking back to see if Vivian had heard. Vivian stood in the dim hallway a long moment, the words settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She thought of Mrs. Bell's face that morning, of Daniel's dirt-streaked hands and the mention of restructured pay, of her mother and hospital bills, and a lifetime of watching people with power decide, quietly, exactly how much other people's dignity was worth. Outside, clouds were already rolling in, thick and dark, promising rain by morning. She had no idea yet how right that instinct would turn out to be, that within 3 days, that same storm would have her hanging by her wrists on the very patio Karen was packing now, screaming for a crime she never committed, while a man everyone believed was 3,000 miles away stood silent in a doorway, watching his fiancée become someone he'd never met. If this kind of story, a woman who refuses to stay silent, a house built on secrets that finally comes undone, is the kind that stays with you long after the credits roll, we think you'll fall in love with the 2 full novels waiting for you right now. One will break your heart. The other will heal it. Both are ready for instant download, with a free audiobook included, the moment you tap the link in the description or the pinned comment. And if you're watching on your TV tonight, just grab your phone, open the camera, and scan the QR code on your screen. Your next favorite story is one scan away. The storm that had been rolling in 3 nights before finally broke on the 3rd evening. And it broke hard, sheets of rain, hammering the estate grounds. The kind of downpour that turns a quiet Tuesday errand into something nobody could have predicted by morning. It started, as these things often do, with something small enough to laugh about in any other house. Vivian was clearing the sideboard in the dining room when she noticed a faint ring of water etched into the polished mahogany beneath one of the crystal glasses. A mark that had been there, if she was honest, since before Karen ever moved into this house. She'd seen it a dozen times over the years, always meant to mention it to Mrs. Bell, always forgot by the time her shift ended. Karen saw it first. "What is this?" Karen's voice cut through the dining room like a blade drawn too fast, and Vivian looked up to find her standing over the sideboard, one manicured finger pressed to the faint stain. "That mark's been there a while, ma'am," Vivian said carefully. "Before my time, I believe." "Before your time," Karen repeated it slowly, like she was tasting something bitter. "Is that what we're calling carelessness now? A convenient inheritance?" "I only meant—" "I don't care what you meant." Karen's eyes had gone flat, that particular stillness Vivian had learned over the last 3 days to read as danger. "This house runs on standards, Vivian. Standards you people seem to think are optional when the man who actually pays for this furniture is on the other side of the world." You people. The words landed, and Vivian let them land without flinching, because flinching was exactly what Karen wanted. Vivian had spent 29 years learning how to keep her face still while something ugly moved through a room. And she wasn't about to lose that skill now, over a watermark on a table that had nothing to do with her at all. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and the first fat drops of rain were already starting to hit the windows. "I want that table refinished by tomorrow morning," Karen said, "and I want you to think very carefully tonight about whether you actually understand what your job in this house is." Vivian said nothing. She'd learned that silence, offered at the right moment, could be its own kind of dignity, the kind that couldn't be taken from her no matter how loud the other person got. She turned to leave the dining room, already thinking through how she'd sand and reseal that section of wood before sunrise, when Karen's voice stopped her at the door. "Where do you think you're going?" "To get supplies for the table, ma'am." "No." Karen crossed the room slowly, unhurried, the way a cat closes distance on something it already knows it's going to catch. "I don't think you understand yet. I think you need something to help you remember." The rain hit like needles, but the ice in her voice was colder. Vivian felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the storm building outside. She'd seen Karen's cruelty in small doses over the last 3 days. The confiscated phones, the slashed break times, the 15-minute lunches that left Daniel Cho eating half a sandwich standing up in the garden shed. But there was something different in Karen's face now, something that had been waiting behind the silk robes and the magazine cover smiles this whole time, finally given room to breathe now that the man who might have checked it was 3,000 miles away. "Come with me," Karen said. What happened next unfolded the way nightmares do, not all at once, but in pieces too fast to fully process, each one worse than the last. Karen led her out through the terrace doors, out into a rain that had gone from downpour to assault in the space of 10 minutes, wind driving it sideways so it stung like something thrown rather than something falling. Vivian's uniform was soaked through before she'd taken 5 steps. "Ma'am, please," Vivian started, and it was the only time in 3 days her voice had come close to pleading, because some part of her still believed, right up until the moment it wasn't true anymore, that this was a threat and not an actual intention. "You don't have to break something to pay for it," Karen said, and there was something almost pleasant in her voice now, something that turned Vivian's stomach worse than the shouting had. "Sometimes you just have to be the one standing closest to it when I decide someone needs to answer for it." There was cord kept near the terrace for the patio awning, heavy nylon rope Daniel used to secure the outdoor furniture before storms. Karen produced it like she'd planned this days in advance, like maybe she had. Like maybe this had never really been about a watermark at all, and Vivian was only now understanding that whatever this was, it had started long before tonight. What had Karen actually been planning? All these quiet nights alone in that house. Vivian didn't fight when Karen bound her wrists, not because she didn't want to, but because some old, hard-won instinct told her that fighting back physically would only give Karen exactly the excuse she seemed to be looking for. So she stood still, jaw tight, rain running down her face and into her collar, while Karen looped the cord around her wrists and threw the other end up over the iron beam of the patio overhang, hauling it taut until Vivian's arms were stretched overhead, and her heels barely kept contact with the wet stone below. "Hang there," Karen said, stepping back to admire her work like she was arranging flowers, "until you remember who owns this ground." The rain came down harder. Vivian's shoulders burned within minutes, the cord biting into her wrists, her uniform plastered to her skin, the cold working its way so deep into her bones that she stopped shivering after a while and just went still, the way the body does when it's protecting whatever warmth it has left. She did not cry. She wanted to, some part of her, 29 years old and standing in freezing rain at midnight for a crime she didn't commit, absolutely wanted to. But she thought of her mother instead, of the woman who'd sat across from hospital administrators for months trying to explain a bill that made no sense, who never once raised her voice, even when the room deserved to hear it raised, who taught Vivian without ever meaning to that, there is a kind of strength that lives entirely in what you refuse to give away. Vivian refused to give Karen her tears. She lifted her chin instead, rain running down her face like it belonged there, and looked past Karen, past the silk robe and the satisfied smile, toward the dark tree line beyond the estate wall, and waited. Karen paced in front of her for a while, pointing, talking about respect and standards, and the difference between people who understood their place and people who didn't. Vivian let the words wash past her the same way the rain did. She'd stopped truly listening somewhere around the second sentence, because she'd realized, with a strange kind of clarity that comes only in the worst moments, that none of this was really about the watermark, or the table, or standards of any kind. This was about Karen needing someone to feel smaller than she did, On a night when the man who might have loved her enough to notice her cruelty was still somewhere over the Pacific, unaware. What Vivian didn't know, what she couldn't have known, hanging there with her arms burning and her lips going numb, was that the man wasn't over the Pacific anymore. His flight had landed hours earlier than scheduled. He was already back on American soil, already in a car headed toward the estate, moving through the same storm that was currently soaking through Vivian's uniform and freezing the blood in her fingers, driven by 4 resignation letters he'd received in the last 2 days, and a growing, cold certainty that something in his house was very wrong. Karen never once looked toward the driveway. She was too busy watching Vivian's face for the moment it would finally break. It didn't break, not that night, not in the way Karen wanted. But somewhere behind her, past the terrace doors, past the warm glow of the house Karen thought was entirely hers to command, headlights were sweeping slowly up the long gravel drive, and Karen Willis had no idea at all that her performance had an audience about to arrive. The car didn't come up the main drive at all. It turned off 200 yards early, onto the narrow service road that ran along the east wall toward the private garage entrance, the one Karen didn't know existed because she'd never once asked to see the parts of this estate that weren't built for showing off. Hansu had made that turn on instinct more than plan. He'd spent the last 6 hours of the flight staring at 4 resignation letters on his phone, reading them over and over the way a man reads something he can't quite believe, trying to understand how a household staff that had been with him for years, some of them since before his mother passed, could all decide, within 48 hours of each other, that they'd rather walk away from good positions than explain why. 2 of the letters had said almost nothing. One had said, "I can no longer, in good conscience, remain employed in this household," and stopped there, like the writer had thought better of finishing the sentence. The 4th had simply said, "I'm sorry," and nothing else. He hadn't told Karen he was coming home early. He hadn't told the driver to announce him, either. Something in him, some old instinct sharpened by years of needing to know the truth of a room before he walked into it, told him to come in quiet. He let himself through the garage, through the mudroom, down the back hallway that led toward the kitchen, and past that, the terrace doors. The house was dark this late, most of the staff long since sent to their quarters, and for a moment everything felt still enough that he almost believed the letters had been some kind of misunderstanding. Then he heard Karen's voice. It carried strangely through the house at that hour, sharp, clipped, rising and falling in a rhythm he didn't recognize, because he'd never once heard her speak that way to him or to anyone in a room he was standing in. He followed it the way you follow a sound you can't place, curiosity turning slowly into something colder with every step closer to the terrace doors. He reached the threshold and stopped. Through the rain-streaked glass, past the doorframe, he saw Karen first, silk robe soaked through at the hem where she'd stepped too far out into the storm, one arm raised, finger extended. Her face lit orange by the patio lamp in a way that made her look like something out of an old painting, the kind with a villain in it. And then, past her, he saw what she was pointing at. Vivian, hanging by her wrists from the terrace beam, rain running off her like she'd been standing under a waterfall for an hour, her uniform plastered black against her skin, her head. And this was the detail that stopped him cold, more than the rope, more than the rain, her head still up, still level, looking somewhere past Karen entirely, out toward the dark tree line, like she decided a long time ago that whatever was happening to her body, her face didn't have to belong to it. He stood in his own doorway like a ghost, returning to a haunted hall. Something moved through Hansu in that moment that he didn't have a word for yet, not in English, not in Korean, not in any language he'd learned to feel comfortable in. It wasn't quite rage, not at first. Rage was loud, and this was the opposite of loud. This was a stillness that settled into his chest and stayed there, cold and absolute, the particular quiet of a man who has just understood that everything he thought he knew about his own house was a lie someone had been telling him on purpose. He didn't step through the doorway. Every instinct in him wanted to cross that terrace in 4 strides and cut the cord himself and put himself physically between Karen and whatever this had become. But some older, colder part of him, the part that had kept him alive and in control of a syndicate for over a decade, told him to wait. told him that if he stepped into that light now, Karen would have 30 seconds to become someone else entirely. The warm, apologetic fiancée, the woman who'd simply lost her temper, the version of herself she'd been performing for him for 2 years. He wanted the truth, not the performance. And the only way to get the truth was to stay exactly where he was and let it keep happening in front of him. Vivian saw him first. Her eyes had drifted, in the middle of one of Karen's sentences, toward the doorway behind her tormentor, and there he was, Lee Han-soo, standing 3 feet behind Karen's shoulder, rein still on his coat, utterly silent, watching. For one terrible, disorienting second, Vivian thought she was hallucinating him out of the cold, the way people sometimes see things that aren't there when their body has taken all it can hold. Then he raised one gloved finger and pressed it to his lips. Quiet. Vivian's breath caught. Every part of her, every year of learning not to trust powerful men, every instinct that told her this could be a trap of a different kind, one where the man in charge simply watched his fiancée's cruelty and did nothing about it either. Every part of that instinct screamed at her to say something, to call his name, to ask him, loudly enough for Karen to hear, whether he knew what was happening in his own house. But something in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't indifference. She'd seen indifference before, on the faces of people who watched suffering and decided it wasn't their problem. This was something else, a fury so controlled, so deliberately banked down that it read almost like patience. Like a man building a case in real time and needing, more than anything, for the witness in front of him not to spoil it. One word, Vivian, and this entire house burns. That was what his eyes said, more clearly than any sentence could have, and somehow, standing there soaked and shaking and strung up like something less than human, Vivian understood exactly what he meant. If she called out now, Karen would simply spin the story before Han-soo had gathered enough to prove otherwise. A misunderstanding. A disciplinary matter blown out of proportion. 2 years of practiced charm against one night of rain-soaked evidence. Karen would win that argument in the time it took to explain it. So Vivian said nothing. She held his eyes for one long second, and something passed between them that neither of them would have been able to name out loud. Not yet trust, not exactly, but the beginning of an understanding. A shared secret. 2 people who had both just realized, in the same rainstorm, that they were looking at the true shape of Karen Willis for the very first time. Then Vivian looked away, back out toward the tree line, and let her face go still again, the way she'd learned to. Karen never turned around. She was too consumed by her own performance to notice that her audience had grown, too satisfied with the sound of her own voice rising, and falling over a woman hanging in the rain to notice the man standing in the doorway behind her. The man whose name was on the deed to this house, whose money paid every wage she'd been illegally slashing for 3 days, whose late mother's photograph hung in the hallway not 40 feet from where she stood. She thought he was in Seoul. He was 3 feet behind her. Han-soo stayed in that doorway for what felt, to Vivian, like an eternity, though it was likely no more than 4 or 5 minutes, watching, memorizing, letting Karen's own words build the case against her one cruel sentence at a time. He noted the mention of the watermark. He noted standards, and your place, and the casual, practiced ease with which Karen wielded cruelty like it was simply a management tool she'd always had access to. And then, just as quietly as he'd arrived, he stepped back from the doorway and disappeared into the dark hallway behind him, leaving Vivian alone with the rain, with Karen's rage, and with a secret so heavy it nearly outweighed the cold. Because somewhere in that house, in the next few minutes, Lee Han-soo was about to make a decision that would determine everything that came after. And Vivian, still hanging from that beam with her wrists raw and her heart pounding for an entirely different reason now, had absolutely no way of knowing whether the man she just silently agreed to trust was about to save her, or simply add her suffering to a ledger of his own. The decision Han-soo made that night, standing alone in the dark hallway with rain still dripping from his coat, was not to confront Karen at all, not yet, not with nothing but his own eyes as a witness. He'd learned long ago, in a business where a single misstep could cost a man everything, that fury without proof was just noise, and noise could be denied, apologized for, wept over until it disappeared into an argument about who misremembered what. What he needed wasn't a confrontation. What he needed was a paper trail, Karen couldn't talk her way around. So instead of walking out onto that terrace and cutting Vivian down himself, he'd gone back through the mudroom, up the servants' stairs, and into the small guest room off the east wing that nobody used. The one Karen had, ironically, declared off-limits after 8 o'clock without knowing her own fiancé would be the one hiding in it. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window and watched the rain and waited for morning, turning the sound of Karen's voice over in his mind, letting it sharpen into something he could actually use. By the time the storm broke and the sun came up gray and reluctant over the estate, he had made a second decision, quieter than the first. He wasn't going to let Karen know he'd come home at all. Not yet. He sent word through his driver, who Karen trusted enough not to question, that the Seoul summit had run long and he'd be delayed another 3 days. He moved through the house using the back staircases and the old servants' corridors his mother had shown him as a boy. Corridors Karen had never once bothered to learn, because why would a woman who saw herself as the lady of the house ever need to know how the help moved through it unseen? Karen, for her part, had no idea her reign had already been quietly declared temporary. The days that followed only confirmed what he'd suspected standing in that doorway. Karen didn't slow down after the storm. If anything, she leaned harder into the role she'd been playing, as though the rain had washed something loose in her, and there was no reason left to hold back. 2 mornings later, Daniel Cho came in from the garden shed looking gray in the face, holding a shattered ceramic planter he swore he hadn't touched. "It was already cracked when I moved it," he told Mrs. Bell in the kitchen, his voice low, careful, the voice of a man who'd learned that explaining yourself too loudly to the wrong person only made things worse. "I set it down soft as anything. It gave." Karen didn't ask for his side of it. She docked $200 from his next paycheck before lunch, the deduction appearing on his stub with a line item that simply read property damage, gross negligence, as though there'd been a hearing, an investigation, anything resembling fairness at all. Daniel needed that $200. Everyone in that kitchen knew it, because everyone in that kitchen knew about the blood pressure medication he split in half some months to make it stretch. A fact he'd never announced, but that Mrs. Bell had quietly noticed years ago and never once mentioned to a soul, out of respect for a man who deserved better than pity. The kitchen girl, barely 20, lost $18 the same week over 2 cracked teacups that had been chipped, not broken, sitting in the cabinet for who knew how long before anyone used them again. Small thefts lead to deep graves. That was the phrase running through Vivian's head now, every time she watched another deduction appear on another pay stub, every time she saw the particular look on a coworker's face. Not rage, not yet, just a kind of tired disbelief. The look of people who work hard and watch someone with more power than sense decide, unilaterally, what their labor is worth. Vivian kept writing it all down, but she'd started doing something more than that now, too. She'd started making copies. She'd found, almost by accident, that the small printer in the household office kept a memory of the last several documents scanned, and one quiet afternoon, while Karen was out at a luncheon with women whose approval she seemed to need the way some people need air, Vivian copied every pay stub she could find with a deduction on it. Daniel's. The kitchen girls. 2 more from groundskeepers who'd been docked for reasons that read, on paper, like fiction dressed up as policy. She didn't yet know what she'd do with them. She only knew that a woman who takes money from people who can't afford to lose it usually isn't careful about how she takes it, and carelessness, written down and dated, has a way of becoming its own kind of confession. What none of them knew, not Vivian, not Daniel, not even Mrs. Bell, who'd worked this estate longer than anyone and thought she'd seen every version of trouble a household could produce, was that Karen wasn't simply pocketing $200 here and $18 there out of pure meanness. There was a rhythm to the deductions that Vivian hadn't noticed yet, a pattern in the dates, and the amounts that, added up over weeks instead of days, would eventually point toward something far larger than spite. Karen wasn't just punishing the staff, she was practicing something. Hansu noticed it before Vivian did, watching from behind the pantry service door one morning, close enough to see Karen at the household office desk, close enough to see her altering a receipt with a steady, practiced hand, changing a delivery total from 400 to 600 and chain, and initialing the correction herself before anyone else in the accounting chain could question it. He watched her do it twice more that week. Small amounts, careful amounts. The kind of numbers a person tests before they attempt something much larger. Look at the numbers, Mr. Lee. She's testing how much we can bleed. He didn't have proof of what the testing was for yet, but he'd built enough businesses, audited enough books, sat across enough tables from men who thought they were smarter than the numbers to recognize the shape of it. Small, deniable thefts first. See what gets questioned. See what gets ignored. See exactly how far you can push before someone with real authority notices, and only then, once you know the ceiling, do you reach for something bigger. He needed to know what Karen was building toward. And he needed someone inside the house who could get him documentation without raising suspicion. Someone Karen had no reason to watch closely. Someone who moved through every room in that house without ever really being seen. He found Vivian in the library 2 nights later, past midnight, in the one room in the house Karen almost never entered because she found it, in her own words, depressingly full of old books nobody reads. Hansu was seated in the dark near the far shelves when Vivian came in to close the windows for the night, and for the second time in a week, she found herself face to face with a man the rest of the house believed was still in Seoul. "You copied the pay stubs," he said quietly, not a question. Vivian's heart climbed into her throat. She thought, for one dizzying second, about denying it. Then she thought about her mother, about a lifetime of watching people decide silence was safer than truth, and she reached into the pocket of her uniform instead and set the folded papers down on the table between them. "Daniels, the kitchen girls, 2 more from the grounds crew," she said. "She thinks servants don't know how to count." Something shifted in Hansu's face. Not quite a smile, but close to one. The particular respect of a man who has just realized the person in front of him is far more capable than the role she's been forced to play. "They know how to count better than she does," he said. "She's just never had anyone check her math." He reached into his own coat and set something beside her stack of pay stubs. A folder, thin but heavy with what looked like receipts, delivery invoices, numbers circled in his own careful handwriting. "I need to know how deep this goes," he said, "and I need you to help me find out without her ever knowing either of us is looking." Vivian looked down at the 2 stacks of paper sitting side by side on the library table, her evidence of cruelty, his evidence of theft, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that whatever Karen Willis had been quietly building in this house over the last week wasn't a temper. It was a plan, and the 2 of them had just, without either one saying it aloud, agreed to find out exactly what it was before it was too late to stop it. If you're the kind of person who believes bullies always slip up eventually, that the receipts, the ledgers, the paper trail always catches up to people who think they're too clever to get caught, hit that subscribe button right now, because Hansu is about to find out exactly how far Karen Willis has been willing to go, and you do not want to miss the moment her own numbers turn against her. It took 3 more days of quiet, careful watching before that plan finally showed itself whole, and it happened not because Hansu went looking for it, but because Karen, comfortable in a house she still believed was entirely hers to command, simply forgot to be careful. He'd taken to spending his afternoons in the music gallery, a narrow balcony space above the study that his mother had built decades ago for a piano. No one played anymore, accessible only by a stairwell tucked behind the linen closet that Karen had never once asked about. From up there, through the old lattice screening meant to let sound drift down without letting anyone see who was listening, Hansu could hear nearly everything that happened in the study below. He'd gone up there that afternoon expecting nothing more than another hour of watching Karen make phone calls to caterers and florists for whatever event she was planning next. What he got instead was Peter Sloan. Hansu recognized the voice before he saw the man, a corporate accountant Karen had brought on 8 months earlier, ostensibly to help manage the household's expanding philanthropic ventures. A hire Hansu had approved without much thought at the time because Karen had framed it as a kindness, a way to formalize the charitable giving she claimed mattered so much to her. He'd never once sat in on a meeting between them. He'd never had a reason to. He had one now. "The number's clean," Sloane was saying, papers rustling below. $27,412, moved in increments small enough that nobody in payroll has flagged a single transaction. It's sitting exactly where you wanted it. "Show me," Karen said, and there was an eagerness in her voice Hansu hadn't heard before, not the practiced warmth she performed at dinner parties, not the icy command she'd used on the terrace in the rain, but something almost girlish, the sound of a woman genuinely delighted with herself. "Domestic Dignity Fund," Sloane read aloud, and Hansu felt something in his chest go very still and very cold. "Account opened under the household's charitable arm 6 weeks ago. On paper, it looks like an internal fund for staff wellness initiatives. In practice, it's mine," Karen finished, and Hansu could hear the smile in it. $27,000 taken from hands that clean her floors. The number moved through him with a weight that had nothing to do with the money itself. He'd built and lost and rebuilt fortunes far larger than that in a single bad quarter, and $27,000 was, in the strict accounting sense of his business, almost nothing. But he understood, sitting in that dark gallery above the study, exactly whose money it actually was. He'd seen the pay stubs Vivian had copied. He knew Daniel Cho's $200 was in that account. He knew the kitchen girl's $18 was in there too, and the deductions from the 2 groundskeepers, and God knew how many smaller thefts he hadn't caught yet. Nickels and dimes bled out of people who couldn't afford to lose a single one of them, gathered together into a fund with a name, so cynical it made his jaw tighten just hearing it spoken aloud. Domestic dignity, as if there were anything dignified about what she'd done to build it. "The gala's in 11 days, Karen went on, and Hansu heard the study chair creak as she settled into it, unhurried, entirely at ease. "I want this presented as a personal contribution, my contribution. The Willis family has always believed in dignity for domestic workers. That's the language I want on the program. I've already spoken to the committee about the framing." "You want to stand up in front of 300 donors," Sloane said slowly, "and take credit for giving away money you took from your own staff." "I want to stand up in front of 300 donors," Karen corrected, "and be seen as exactly the kind of woman Lee Han-soo should be proud to marry, which, incidentally, is also true. Nobody's going to ask where the check came from, Peter. They never do. They just applaud. They don't ask where charity money comes from. They just applaud the check." It was, Han-soo thought, one of the truest and ugliest things he'd ever heard someone say out loud without a hint of shame attached to it. He'd spent his whole life around people who understood how to launder a reputation the way other people laundered money. He'd simply never imagined the woman wearing his ring would turn out to be one of them, working the trick on his own house, using his own staff as the raw material. He thought of his mother then, unbidden, the way he sometimes did in moments that demanded a steadiness he wasn't sure he had left in him. His mother had built the foundation this house's charitable giving actually flowed through. A real one, established after years of watching her own family claw up out of very little, built specifically so that no one who worked for her would ever again feel the particular humiliation of being poor in a rich man's house. Han-soo had grown up watching her write checks to women exactly like the ones currently having their wages quietly bled into an account with a name that mocked the very idea she died believing in. Below him, Sloane's voice had turned careful, testing. "And after the gala, once the 27's been laundered through the good press, what's the actual plan here, Karen? This can't just be about looking generous at one party." There was a pause, a long one, long enough that Han-soo found himself leaning forward slightly in the dark, straining to hear whatever answer Karen was weighing whether or not to give. "The 27 was never the plan," Karen finally said, and something in her voice had shifted, quieter now, more careful, the sound of a woman choosing her words the way you choose them when you're finally about to say the real thing out loud. "The 27 was the test. I needed to know how far I could move money through this house without anyone noticing. Now I know. She isn't just cruel, she's foolish enough to leave a paper trail." Han-soo sat very still in the dark of the music gallery, his hands flat against his knees, every part of him wanting to stand up and walk down those stairs and demand she finish that sentence to his face. But he didn't move. He'd come this far on patience. He wasn't going to spend it now, not when she was one sentence away from telling him, telling the empty room, telling Sloane, telling anyone who happened to be listening, exactly what $27,000 had actually been practice for. "So what's the real number?" Sloane asked, and even through the floor Hansu could hear the accountant's voice had gone tight, the sound of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that he'd agreed to something considerably larger than he'd understood. Karen didn't answer right away. Hansu heard her rise from the chair, heard her footsteps cross toward the window, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped low enough that he had to lean forward until the old lattice screen pressed against his shoulder just to catch it. $8 million, she said, and it's not coming from payroll. Hansu felt the floor of the gallery seem to tilt beneath him, the number landing somewhere he hadn't braced for at all. $8 million was not household mismanagement. $8 million was not a cruel woman skimming wages to feel powerful in a house that wasn't fully hers. $8 million was something else entirely, something with a target, something with a plan behind it, large enough that 27,000 had simply been the smallest possible test of whether the pipes would hold. And before he could finish the thought, before he could even fully absorb the number still hanging in the air of the study below him, he heard Karen say 4 more words that turned everything cold. Starting with his mother's foundation. If a woman using your own mother's legacy as her personal piggy bank makes you want to throw something at your television right now, you are exactly the audience this story was written for, because Karen Willis just made the biggest mistake of her life, and Hansu heard every word of it. And if stories like this one, where the people who look past you are the ones who end up regretting it most, are the kind that stay with you long after the screen goes dark, we think you'll fall in love with the 2 full novels waiting for you right now. One will break your heart. The other will heal it. Both are ready for instant download, with a free audiobook included, the moment you tap the link in the description or the pinned comment. And if you're watching on your TV tonight, grab your phone, open the camera, and scan the QR code on your screen. Your next favorite story is 1 scan away. Those 4 words, starting with his mother's foundation, stayed with Hansu through the rest of that day and well into the night, sitting in his chest like a stone he couldn't put down. And by the time he found Vivian in the library again, he was no longer a man weighing whether to act. He was a man who wanted to walk downstairs, put his hands on Karen Willis's desk, and demand she explain herself before he called the authorities himself. He told Vivian as much, standing among the same shelves where they'd first traded evidence a week earlier, his voice low but urgent in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "I have enough," he said. "The account, Sloane's own words. I could end this tonight." Vivian listened to all of it, the anger underneath the careful control, the $8 million, his mother's foundation. And she understood, watching him, that she was looking at a man standing at the very edge of his own patience, and that if she didn't say something now, he was going to walk downstairs and burn the whole plan down in one furious confrontation that Karen would somehow, someway, talk her way out of. "If you confront her tonight," Vivian said carefully, "she'll cry. She'll say it's a misunderstanding. She'll say Sloane misspoke, or she was speaking hypothetically, or that the fund was always meant to be temporary before it got transferred back. And you'll have nothing but your word against hers, in a house where everyone already believes you're still in Seoul." Hansu's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "Confront her now," Vivian said, "and she lies. Let her speak on stage, in front of 300 witnesses she can't control, and she hangs herself." It was the first time Vivian had spoken to him with that particular authority, not the careful deference of a woman speaking to her employer's fiancé, but something closer to an equal laying out a plan. And Hansu found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, listening rather than deciding. He'd spent his whole life being the man in the room whose word ended the conversation. He sat with the strange, humbling recognition that the smartest voice in this particular room did not belong to him. "Go on," he said. Vivian had thought about little else for the last 2 days, turning the shape of it over in her mind, while she folded linens and polished silver and moved through a house that still had no idea what was quietly assembling itself in its own library. "The gala is in 11 days, she said. She's planning to present the 27,000 as her own charity. That means she needs a story. A good one. Something that makes her look generous in front of people whose approval she's been chasing since the day she got that ring. Vivian nodded toward Hansu's hand, though he wasn't wearing anything. The gesture meaning Karen's engagement, the life she'd built her whole performance around protecting. She's going to need a face for that story, Vivian continued. Someone who represents the staff she claims she's helped. Someone grateful, someone humble, someone who'll stand next to her on that stage and let 300 wealthy donors feel good about their evening. Hansu understood before she said it, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face for the first time in days. You. She already told Mrs. Bell she wants me there, Vivian said. Presentable, grateful, a good story for the program. Vivian's mouth pulled into something tight, not quite a smile either, more the particular expression of a woman who has just realized the person trying to use her has handed her exactly the weapon she needed. You want me on stage? I'll give you a performance. Hansu studied her for a long moment, the kind of look Vivian imagined he probably gave business partners across boardroom tables, assessing, careful, searching for the flaw in a plan before he'd commit resources to it. She'll have you standing there to make herself look generous, he said slowly. You're saying you want to use that same stage to expose her instead, in front of everyone, with no way for her to spin it into a misunderstanding after the fact. Not everyone gets caught with an audience watching, Vivian said. Most people who steal from folks like Daniel and me, they get caught quiet, behind closed doors, and by the time anybody with real power hears about it, it's already been explained away as a mistake, a miscommunication, a woman just trying her best. I've watched that happen my whole life. I watched it happen to my mother when a hospital took everything she had and called it an accounting error. Vivian's voice didn't rise, didn't shake, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there in the earlier conversations, something that sounded, to Hansu's ear, remarkably like resolve settling permanently into place. Karen doesn't get that mercy, not from me. Let her build her own stage. Let her put the microphone in my hand herself. I'll tell 300 people exactly where that $27,000 came from, in front of every camera, and every donor she's been trying to impress since the day she walked into this house. For a long moment, Hansu said nothing at all. He simply looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't quite allowed himself to before, seeing not the maid who cleared his dining table or the woman he'd found tied up in a rainstorm, but a strategist, sharp and patient, and entirely capable of building a trap more elegant than anything he might have managed alone in his anger. You've thought about this, he said, for longer than tonight. I've thought about it every day since I stood in that rain, Vivian said simply. A woman can only be underestimated for so long before she decides to use it. The stage is set, but the script isn't hers. It was the thought Hansu carried with him as he sat back against the library shelves, letting Vivian's plan settle into place beside his own evidence. Sloane's confession about the $8 million, the account records, the pay stubs, all of it now aimed not at a private, deniable confrontation, but at a single, unignorable public moment 11 days from now. But even as the plan crystallized between them, a new question rose in Hansu's mind, one he hadn't considered until just then. If $27,000 had only ever been a test, a small trial run to see whether Karen could move money through the household without detection, then what exactly was the $8 million plan itself going to look like? A wire transfer of that size didn't simply appear on a gala program. It required infrastructure, timing, someone on the inside of the actual foundation's accounts. Sloane had said starting with, which meant there was a then what that neither of them had heard yet, a second half of Karen's plan still hidden somewhere in that account, or in Sloane's laptop, or in a conversation neither of them had been in the room for. Hansu realized, with a fresh chill, that exposing the $27,000 at the gala might only be step one. If they weren't careful, humiliating Karen in public could tip her off just enough to accelerate whatever the real theft actually was. And $8 million moved in a panic was far more dangerous than $8 million moved on a careful, trackable schedule. He said as much to Vivian, and watched her expression sharpen further, already working the problem the way she'd clearly been working every problem this house had thrown at her for weeks. Then we don't just expose the 27,000, Vivian said slowly. We need to know what Sloan knows before that stage lights ever come up. We need someone watching him too. Hansu nodded, already thinking through which of his own people he could bring in quietly, discreetly, without alerting Karen that the ground beneath her had shifted. The plan Vivian had built in a matter of days had grown, in the span of one library conversation, from a single public confrontation into something far more precise. A trap with 2 triggers instead of 1, timed to spring before Karen could ever see it coming. 2 days later, Karen found Vivian polishing silver in the dining room and informed her, without so much as looking up from her phone, that she'd been selected to represent the household staff at the upcoming charity gala. A small speaking role, nothing complicated, just a few grateful words about the household's generosity before the donation was announced. Wear something presentable, Karen said, already walking away. This is an important night for me. Vivian set down the silver polish, folded her hands the way she always did, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, something that felt dangerously close to a smile. It was, she thought, going to be an important night for both of them. That important night arrived 11 days later in the form of a ballroom lit gold from floor to ceiling. 300 of the city's wealthiest donors seated at round tables draped in white linen. And Vivian Desmond standing just off the edge of the stage in a simple black dress. Mrs. Bell had pressed for her that afternoon, watching Karen Willis take the microphone like a woman stepping into the exact moment she'd been rehearsing her entire life for. Good evening, Karen said, her voice carrying warm and practiced across the room, the chandelier light catching the diamonds at her throat. Tonight isn't just about celebrating another successful year for this foundation. Tonight is about something closer to my heart. Vivian stood very still, hands folded in front of her, and let her eyes move briefly across the room, past the tables of donors in tuxedos and gowns, past the string quartet tucked in the corner, until she found Hansu seated near the front, dressed like any other guest at the gala, indistinguishable from the wealthy men around him except for the way his eyes never once left the stage. He gave her nothing, no nod, no signal, because they'd agreed there would be none. This part belonged entirely to her. When I came into this family, Karen continued, I saw an opportunity to do something meaningful, not just to plan beautiful events, but to actually change lives. Which is why tonight, I'm proud to announce a personal donation of $25,000 to establish the Domestic Dignity Fund, supporting the household workers who keep our homes running with grace and devotion. The room applauded, warm and easy, exactly the way Karen had promised Sloan they would. Vivian watched the applause ripple across those tables, watched people who had never once asked where a check came from simply lift their hands and clap, satisfied, comfortable, already moving on in their minds to the next course being served. They don't ask where charity money comes from, they just applaud the check. And I couldn't think of a better way to honor this cause, Karen went on, turning now, extending one graceful hand toward the edge of the stage, than to introduce someone who represents exactly the kind of hardworking spirit this fund was created to celebrate. Vivian, come on up here. Vivian walked toward the stage steps with the same measured calm she'd carried into every room in that house for 2 years, climbing up into the gold light with her chin level and her hands steady. And if anyone in that ballroom noticed the particular stillness in her face, they likely mistook it for shyness rather than what it actually was. The last quiet breath before a woman steps off a ledge she spent 11 days building on purpose. Karen handed her the microphone with a warm, practiced smile, the kind she'd perfected in front of mirrors for exactly this purpose. Tell them how well we treat you, Vivian, she said, low enough to sound intimate, loud enough for the front tables to catch it, a script she expected to be followed without deviation. Vivian held the microphone for a moment. She looked out at the room, at all those faces waiting for a few grateful sentences, a pleasant story, 30 seconds of gratitude before the band started up again, and something in her chest, some old weight she'd been carrying since a rainstorm 11 days ago, finally settled into place. I've worked in that house for 2 years, Vivian said, and her voice, calm and clear, carried easily through the sound system, no tremor in it at all. Yesterday, Karen Willis docked my pay $12 for a water glass I never broke. The warm murmur of the room shifted, subtly, a few heads tilting, a few smiles beginning to falter at the edges. Karen's own smile stayed frozen in place a beat too long. Vivian. 2 weeks ago, Vivian continued, reaching into the small clutch she'd carried onto the stage. She fined our gardener $200 for a planter that was already cracked before he ever touched it. Money he needed for his blood pressure medication. She unfolded the papers in her hand, copies, careful and clean, the same pay stubs she'd shown Han-Soo in the library 11 nights earlier. She docked a 20-year-old kitchen worker $18 over 2 chipped teacups that had been sitting broken in a cabinet for months. This isn't the time. Karen's hand moved toward the microphone, but Vivian turned slightly, just enough to keep it out of reach without ever raising her voice or her eyes. Look at the stubs in my hand, Vivian said, holding them up toward the room, toward the cameras from the local society pages already turning to catch every second of it, before you clap for her check. Because the $25,000 she just asked you to applaud didn't come from the Willis family. It came from deductions like these. From wages taken, $12 and $18 and $200 at a time, off the backs of people who clean her floors and tend her gardens and cook her meals. The room had gone fully silent now, 300 people frozen mid-reach for their champagne glasses, the string quartet's bow arm hesitating over the strings. Vivian, that's enough, Karen said, her voice sharpening, the warmth gone entirely now, panic beginning to bleed through the careful composure she'd maintained for 2 years. You clearly don't understand the accounting. I understand it perfectly, Vivian said, and for the first time, she turned to look directly at Karen, close enough now that only the two of them could see the particular stillness in each other's faces. I understand it because I copied every one of these pay stubs myself, and I understand it because there's an account called the Domestic Dignity Fund that was opened 6 weeks ago, and every dollar deducted from every paycheck in that house went straight into it before it ever came out again tonight as your personal donation. Karen's face had gone the color of the tablecloths, her hand still reaching uselessly toward a microphone that was no longer hers to control. And then, from the back of the ballroom, a chair scraped against the floor. Mrs. Bell stood first, 60-something and steady, her voice carrying clear across the stunned silence of the room. She's telling the truth. I've worked in that house 11 years, and I've never seen deductions like this until 3 weeks ago. Beside her, Daniel Cho rose as well, his hands still bearing the calluses of 30 years working the estate grounds, his voice quieter but no less certain. $200, he said, for a planter I never broke. One by one, staff members Vivian hadn't even known were seated at the back tables that night, brought as extra service staff for the event, never meant to be seen, let alone heard, began to stand, a slow ripple of quiet, dignified refusal spreading through a ballroom that had spent the last 20 minutes applauding the very woman who'd stolen from every one of them. Karen stood frozen center stage, the microphone dangling uselessly at her side, 300 donors staring at her with expressions that had shifted, in the span of 90 seconds, from warm admiration to something closer to horror. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera light blinked on, then another, then a dozen more, the room's most powerful people quietly documenting the exact moment Karen Willis's carefully built reputation began coming apart in real time. This is a misunderstanding, Karen said, her voice cracking now, reaching for the practiced warmth that had carried her through 2 years of exactly this kind of room and finding, for the first time that it wouldn't come. These are accounting discrepancies. They'll be corrected. I never intended. You intended exactly this, came a voice from the crowd, low and even, cutting through Karen's unraveling excuse with the particular calm of a man who had waited 11 patient days for this precise moment. Every head in that ballroom turned as Lee Han-Soo rose from his table near the front and began walking, unhurried, toward the stage. And Karen Willis, staring at the fiancé she believed was still somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, felt the floor of her entire carefully constructed world finally give way beneath her. If you've ever worked hard for someone who took the credit and left you with nothing, type justice below right now, because Vivian Desmond just did what so many of us never got the chance to, and Karen Willis is about to learn there is no applause coming for her tonight. Hansu reached the stage steps just as Karen found her voice again, and what came out of her was not an apology. "You've been here the whole time," she said, staring at him, and something in her face shifted from panic into a colder, faster calculation, the look of a woman recognizing that the story she'd controlled for 2 years had just ended and doing rapid math on what came next. How long have you been?" "Long enough," Hansu said quietly, climbing the last step onto the stage, close enough now that only Karen, Vivian, and the microphone still dangling in Karen's hand could hear him clearly, though every phone in that ballroom was recording regardless. "Long enough to hear you tell Peter Sloan about a fund called Domestic Dignity. Long enough to hear you call $27,000 a test." Karen's face drained of what little color remained in it. "You were in the gallery." "I was in my own house," Hansu said, "listening to my fiancé plan to steal from my staff." Somewhere near the side of the stage, a man in an ill-fitting suit had gone very still. Peter Sloan, who'd been seated with Karen's table all evening under the pretense of overseeing the foundation's presentation, and who now looked like a man watching his own future collapse in real time along with hers. Hansu turned toward him, and something in his expression made Sloan take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Sloan," Hansu said, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who had run negotiations far more dangerous than this one, "you're going to want to think very carefully about your next sentence. Because right now, you are an accountant who helped falsify records for a woman skimming wages. In about 30 seconds, depending on what you say, you're going to be something considerably worse." Sloane's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Vivian, still holding the microphone loosely at her side, watched the man's composure crack in a way Karen's hadn't. Karen had spent 2 years building armor for exactly this kind of moment, but Sloane had clearly never expected to be standing in a spotlight when the truth finally surfaced. "It wasn't 27,000, Sloane said, the words tumbling out of him now, low and fast, like a man trying to outrun his own guilt before it caught him entirely. "That was never the real number. The Domestic Dignity Fund was a test account, a proof of concept, to see if wage deductions could move through the household's books without tripping any audit flags. It worked. So 3 weeks ago, she had me build the real transfer." "How much?" Hansu said. It wasn't a question, it was a demand. $8 million. Sloane's voice cracked on the number. "Rooted out of your mother's foundation trust. Automated, scheduled, structured to look like a routine disbursement to an overseas charitable partner. It clears tonight, at midnight." It wasn't 27,000. It was 8 million. The words landed in Hansu's chest like something physical, a blow he hadn't braced for even after everything he'd already heard in that music gallery. His mother's foundation. The one she'd built with her own hands, out of her own memory of what it felt like to have nothing. Meant to protect people exactly like Vivian, exactly like Daniel, exactly like every staff member who just stood up in that ballroom to tell the truth. And Karen had been planning to hollow it out entirely, using his own trust in her as the key that opened the door. "Cancel it," Hansu said to Sloane. "Now, whatever access you have, whatever passwords, whatever authorization codes, you cancel that transfer immediately, or I promise you, the wage theft will be the smallest of your problems." Sloane was already reaching for his phone, hands shaking, when Karen's voice cut across the stage. And this time, there was nothing composed left in it at all. "You cancel that transfer," Karen said, "and Daniel Cho doesn't make it to sunrise." The ballroom, which had already gone silent once that night, somehow found a deeper, more terrible silence still. Vivian felt her whole body go cold in a way the rainstorm 3 weeks earlier had never quite managed, because she understood, in that instant, exactly why Daniel hadn't come back to his seat after standing up to speak the truth about his docked pay. She'd assumed he'd simply stepped out for air, overwhelmed by the moment, the way any 62-year-old man might be after finally saying out loud what he'd swallowed silently for weeks. She hadn't seen him leave through the side entrance. She hadn't seen the two men waiting for him near the loading dock, men who did not belong to the catering staff or the valet service, men who had been positioned there for exactly this contingency, in case anything at the gala went sideways enough to threaten the transfer. "What did you do?" Hansu said, and his voice had gone very quiet now, quieter than Vivian had ever heard it, the particular quiet of a man whose fury had gone past the point of raising his voice at all. "Insurance," Karen said, and though her hands were shaking, though her carefully constructed composure had shattered completely in front of 300 witnesses, there was still something defiant underneath it, the last desperate posture of a cornered animal deciding whether to run or fight. "I knew this could happen. I knew someone might figure it out before midnight. So 2 of my brother's people have been holding your gardener at Pier 9 since he stepped outside 20 minutes ago." Her eyes moved between Hansu and Sloane, calculating, still searching for some version of this night where she came out with something. "If that money doesn't clear by midnight, the gardener doesn't see sunrise. So you have a choice, Hansu. You can let Peter finish the transfer quietly, and Daniel goes home to his wife by morning. Or you can call the police right now and explain to them in real time exactly how fast they can find a warehouse at Pier 9 before a very old man runs out of time." Vivian's stomach dropped through the stage floor. She thought of Daniel's calloused hands, his careful voice at the microphone only minutes ago, the way he'd stood up for himself for the first time in weeks despite every instinct telling him it was safer to stay seated and silent. He had done the brave thing tonight. He had trusted that speaking the truth would matter. And somewhere across the city, in the dark of a waterfront warehouse, he was paying for that courage in a way none of them had anticipated. Hansu's face had gone perfectly still, the same terrible stillness Vivian had first seen in him standing in that terrace doorway 3 weeks earlier, watching Karen's cruelty and choosing, deliberately, not to react yet. But this was different. This wasn't patience anymore. This was a man doing rapid, silent calculations about how many minutes stood between this ballroom and a man's life, and what it would cost to close that gap in time. "You took my mother's legacy," Hansu said, low and even, each word landing with the precision of something sharpened for exactly this moment, "and used my staff as leverage." Karen didn't flinch. Whatever remained of the woman who'd once smiled warmly at charity luncheons was gone entirely now, replaced by something colder, more desperate, and far more dangerous than anyone in that ballroom had understood her capable of being 20 minutes earlier. "I used what worked," Karen said. "Now decide, Hansu. The clock's still running, and it isn't going to wait for you to feel your feelings about it." Somewhere in Hansu's coat pocket, his phone had already begun buzzing. A call from the head of his own security detail, the men he'd quietly deployed days earlier to watch the gala's exits as an extra precaution. And as he pulled it free and pressed it to his ear, his eyes never leaving Karen's face, Vivian watched something shift behind his expression that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever came next in this ballroom was no longer the ending of anyone's carefully laid trap. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, with a clock now counting down toward midnight, and a man's life hanging in the balance of how fast the truth could move once it finally started running. If you believe dignity is something money can never buy, and that people like Daniel Cho deserve to make it home safe simply for having the courage to speak the truth, hit that subscribe button right now, because this fight isn't over, and we need you here for what happens next. The voice on the other end of Hansu's phone belonged to a man named Griggs, head of his private security for 11 years, and the first thing he said was the thing that mattered most. "We have eyes on him. He's alive." Hansu closed his eyes for one brief second, the only outward sign, in that entire frozen ballroom, that the words had cost him something to hear, and then his voice came back level and cold, the voice of a man who had run out of patience for anything but results. "Where?" "Warehouse on Pier 9 Harbor Sector. We picked up the delivery truck on traffic cameras 8 minutes ago. It never actually left the docks tonight. The manifest was fake." Griggs's voice was clipped, efficient, a soldier's cadence Hansu had trusted through worse nights than this one. "2 men inside with him, maybe 3. We're staging now. Say the word." Check the gate records, Hansu said, already moving, already handing his phone briefly to Vivian while he shrugged out of his suit jacket like a man preparing for something the tuxedo hadn't been designed for. The truck never left the harbor sector. Confirm the exact bay before you breach. I am not losing him to a wrong door. Copy that. He turned to Karen then, and whatever composure had briefly cracked in her only minutes earlier had hardened back into something brittle and defiant, a woman betting everything on the idea that Hansu would still, somehow, choose the money over the man. The wire hasn't cleared yet, she said. There's still time to make the smart choice. There is no version of tonight, Hansu said, where you walk away with anything. He looked past her to Sloane, who was still frozen near the edge of the stage with his phone clutched in both hands like it might save him. Kill the transfer. Every account, every authorization, right now, in front of these officers. 2 uniformed police, alerted by hotel security the moment the ballroom had erupted, were already moving through the stunned crowd toward the stage. And you're going to hand over every ledger with her signature on it. Sloane didn't hesitate. Whatever loyalty he'd owed Karen had evidently expired the moment kidnapping entered the conversation, and his fingers moved fast across his phone, canceling authorization codes with the frantic efficiency of a man trying to prove, too late, that he could still be the reasonable one in this story. Hansu was already walking, Vivian half a step behind him, when Karen's voice rose one last time across the ballroom, sharp with the particular fury of someone watching every piece of leverage dissolve at once. You'll never make it there in time. He didn't turn around. I don't need to make it in time, he said. I need my men to. The drive to the harbor took 11 minutes that felt, to Vivian, like 11 hours. Hansu behind the wheel himself, having waved off his driver entirely, weaving through late-night traffic with a controlled intensity that made clear exactly how much of the calm, careful businessman she'd come to know over the last 3 weeks had been, all along, a performance layered over something far more dangerous underneath. She hadn't asked to come. She'd simply gotten into the car when he opened the door for her, and he hadn't argued, because there was no time to argue, and because some part of him seemed to understand that she needed to see this through to its end as much as he did. You don't have to do this part, he said once, at a red light that he ran through anyway. Daniel stood up in that ballroom because I asked him to trust me, Vivian said. I'm not sitting in a car 3 blocks away while he finds out what that trust cost him. Hansu didn't argue further. Griggs's team had already staged by the time they arrived at the edge of the harbor sector. 4 vehicles parked without headlights along the access road. 6 men in dark tactical gear, moving with the quiet precision of people who had rehearsed exactly this kind of night more times than Vivian wanted to think about. Hansu pulled the car in behind them and was out the door before it had fully stopped rolling. Talk to me, he said to Griggs. Confirmed bay, red door north side, single entry point they're watching. 2 hostiles visible on thermal, possibly a 3rd inside near the back. Griggs's voice was steady, professional, a man laying out facts rather than feelings. Gardeners alive, seated, hands bound. No visible weapons on the hostiles besides sidearms. Hansu's jaw tightened at bound, but his voice stayed level. Breach the red door, he said. Leave no one standing who's a threat to that man's life. Everyone else I want alive and talking to the police within the hour. Vivian stood at the edge of the staging area, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching 6 men move toward a dark warehouse with the same unhurried, absolute confidence Hansu carried into every room he'd ever walked into. She thought of Daniel's hands, calloused from 30 years of gardening, shaking slightly as he'd stood at that microphone only an hour earlier to say 12 words that had, apparently, put his life in danger the moment he'd finished saying them. She thought about how much courage it had taken for a 62-year-old man who needed to split his blood pressure medication to make it stretch to stand up in a ballroom full of powerful strangers and simply tell the truth. What if courage isn't enough tonight, she thought, and immediately hated the thought and couldn't quite make it stop. The next 90 seconds happened faster than Vivian could fully track, a coordinated movement toward the red door, a brief, controlled commotion inside the warehouse, muffled shouts that cut off almost as quickly as they started, and then, unbearably, silence. Vivian's hands had curled into fists at her sides without her noticing, and beside her, even Han-Soo's controlled stillness had tightened into something closer to held breath. Then Griggs's voice crackled through the radio clipped to Han-Soo's collar. "Secure, Gardner safe, both hostiles in custody, no casualties on our end." Vivian's knees nearly gave out with the relief of it. They found Daniel Cho sitting on an overturned crate near the back of the warehouse a few minutes later, hands finally freed, a security team member draping a jacket over his shoulders, while he blinked against the sudden flood of light from the tactical team's lamps. He looked smaller than Vivian remembered him looking that afternoon in the estate garden, older, more fragile. But when his eyes found Vivian crossing the warehouse floor toward him, something in his face steadied immediately. "You came," he said, his voice rough but clear. "Of course I came," Vivian said, crouching in front of him, taking his still trembling hands in hers. "You stood up for the truth tonight. I wasn't about to let you finish paying for that alone." Daniel's eyes moved past her shoulder to Han-Soo, who had crossed the warehouse and was crouched now on Daniel's other side, his expression stripped of every ounce of the cold precision he'd carried through the breach only minutes earlier, replaced by something that looked almost like grief, almost like guilt. "I'm sorry," Han-Soo said quietly. "This should never have touched you. It should never have touched any of you." "Wasn't your doing, sir," Daniel said, and despite everything, despite the last terrifying hour of his life, there was something steady and forgiving in the old man's voice that made Vivian's throat tighten. Was hers. Han-Soo nodded once, and something in his face hardened back into resolve as he rose to his feet, already pulling his phone free to call the number that would connect him directly to the police captain waiting back at the gala, the one who by now had almost certainly finished collecting Peter Sloane's signed confession and the ledgers bearing Karen's own handwriting. "The transfer is dead, Karen," Han-Soo said quietly, though she wasn't there to hear it. The words meant for himself as much as for her, a private accounting of everything that had just ended. "And so is your future." But as he turned to help Vivian get Daniel to his feet, one of Griggs's men jogged over from the far side of the warehouse, holding a black duffel bag they'd found stashed behind a stack of shipping pallets. And the look on the man's face, grim, careful, deliberately controlled, told Han-Soo, before a single word was spoken, that whatever was inside that bag was about to complicate a night he'd believed, only seconds earlier, was finally, mercifully over. What Griggs's man had found inside that duffel bag turned out to be nearly $200,000 in cash, along with a second set of passports bearing Karen's photograph under a different name. Evidence, once handed over to the detectives waiting at the harbor, that the gala had never been the end of Karen Willis's plan at all. It had been her contingency. If the $27,000 had gone unnoticed, and the $8 million had cleared clean, she would have vanished before morning with more money than most people saw in a lifetime, leaving Han-Soo and the household, and the truth itself buried somewhere she never intended anyone to dig it up. She never got the chance to use it. By the time the sun rose over the harbor, Karen Willis was in police custody, along with Peter Sloane and the two men who'd held Daniel Cho through the longest hour of his life, and the story that would run in the society pages that week would have nothing to do with a charitable donation at all. The weeks that followed moved with a quiet, deliberate efficiency that Vivian came to understand was simply how Han-Soo operated once the danger had passed and the accounting could begin. He didn't make a public spectacle of what came next, the way Karen might have. He simply did the work. Every dollar deducted from every staff member's pay over those 3 weeks was returned within the month, along with interest calculated back to the exact date of each unlawful fine. Daniel's $200, the kitchen girl's $18, every quiet theft Karen had disguised as discipline. Han-Soo didn't stop there. He established an independent oversight board for the estate's operations, 3 people with no personal stake in the household, whose sole job was to ensure that no single person, not a fiancé, not a manager, not even Han-Soo himself, could ever again make unilateral decisions about another person's livelihood without accountability standing in the way. He dissolved the engagement formally and quietly, through lawyers rather than headlines, though the headlines found the story anyway, because a gala full of witnesses with cell phones rarely stays quiet for long. Mrs. Bell retired that spring with a pension Han-soo insisted on doubling, though she told anyone who'd listen that she planned to keep coming back twice a week anyway, just to keep an eye on things. Daniel Cho's garden bloomed that summer more beautifully than it had in years, and if his hands shook a little less now, carrying the weight of medication he no longer needed to ration, nobody who knew what he'd survived begrudged him the ease of it. And Vivian went back to school. She'd been quietly enrolled in a hospitality management program for over a year before any of this happened, taking evening classes after long days at the estate, telling almost no one because she'd learned early that some dreams survive better in silence than under the weight of other people's doubt. Han-soo found out about it by accident, reading through the personnel files during the oversight transition, and when he asked her about it directly one afternoon in the library, the same library where they'd first traded evidence in the dark, she told him the truth plainly, the way she told him everything now. "I want to run something someday," she said. "Not just clean it, run it." "Then finish," he said. "And when you do, there's a position waiting for you here if you want it, not out of gratitude, because you've earned it." Vivian had looked at him for a long moment in that library, weighing the offer the way she weighed everything now, carefully, without letting gratitude cloud her judgment, without letting anyone's kindness, even his, feel like a debt she owed rather than a door she was choosing to walk through or not. "I don't want it handed to me," she said finally. "I want to walk in the front door because I earned the title, not because I survived something in the rain." Something in Han-soo's face had shifted then, not disappointment, but respect, deep and immediate, the particular respect of a man who had built an empire on exactly that same principle and recognized it instantly in someone else. "Finish your degree," he said. "Then come back and take the job on your own terms. I'll be waiting." She finished 8 months later, top of her class, walking across a stage that had nothing to do with rope or rain or stolen wages. A stage built entirely for her own accomplishment, with her own name called into a microphone she held because she'd earned the right to hold it, not because someone else had handed it to her as a prop. Her mother would have been proud. Vivian thought about her often in those final months of school, about the hospital bills that had taught her, too young, what it looked like when powerful people decided ordinary lives were negotiable. She thought about how her mother had never gotten the chance to stand in a spotlight and make anyone answer for what had been taken from her. Vivian carried that unfinished justice with her every day she sat in a classroom instead of giving up. Every hour she spent studying financial systems, specifically, so she'd never again be a woman who could be quietly cheated without knowing exactly how the theft had been engineered. The morning she returned to the estate, she didn't come through the service entrance. She walked up the same long gravel drive Han-soo's car had once disappeared down at the start of all of this, dressed not in a uniform, but in a tailored charcoal suit Mrs. Bell had helped her pick out the week before, carrying a leather portfolio instead of a linen cart, and when she reached the front doors, the ones she'd polished 1,000 times from the outside, without ever once walking through them as anything but staff, she paused for just a moment before pushing them open herself. Han-soo was waiting in the foyer, dressed for a normal Tuesday morning of business, and something in his face when he saw her cross that threshold told her he understood exactly what the moment cost her to walk into so calmly, and exactly what it meant. "You came back," he said, and there was a warmth in it now that had nothing to do with the cold urgency of that rain-soaked night 3 years. No, less than a year now, though it felt like a different lifetime entirely. "This time," Vivian said, setting her portfolio down on the front hall table like she'd been doing it for years, "I chose to." He extended his hand, not as an employer, not as the man who had once found her tied up in a storm and stood frozen with fury in a doorway, but as one professional greeting another. "Executive Director of Operations," he said. "The board approved the position unanimously last week, though I suspect you already knew that." "I read the minutes," Vivian said, allowing herself, finally, a real smile. "I told you I don't want anything I haven't earned, including advance notice." He laughed, An easy, genuine sound Vivian hadn't heard from him often, not in all the tension of that terrible autumn. And for a moment, standing together in that grand foyer where everything had once gone so wrong, the estate felt like exactly what it had always been meant to be. A house built not on who held power over whom, but on the kind of dignity that survives every attempt to strip it away. Mrs. Bell found them there a few minutes later, arms crossed, beaming the particular pride of a woman who had trained Vivian on her very first day and never once doubted, even in the darkest of that autumn's nights, that this was where it would all lead. Daniel appeared through the garden entrance not long after, hands full of the season's first cut flowers, setting them in a vase on the front hall table without a word, the way he always had, except now he did it as a man who worked for a woman he'd once helped protect, in a house that finally protected him back. Vivian stood in the center of it all, the foyer, the flowers, the staff who'd once stood beside her on a stage and told the truth together, and understood something she hadn't fully grasped until that exact moment. The uniform she'd worn for 2 years was gone. But the woman who'd worn it, the one who'd endured a rainstorm without breaking, who'd built a case out of pay stubs and patience, who'd walked onto a stage and spoken truth to a room full of people who'd rather have kept clapping, that woman hadn't disappeared when the uniform came off. She'd simply been waiting, the whole time, for the world to catch up to what she already knew about herself. The uniform was gone. The authority was hers. If you've made it all the way to this final chapter, if you were with Vivian in that rainstorm, in that library, on that stage, in that warehouse, and now here in this foyer where she finally walks in as an equal, thank you. Truly. Stories like hers only mean something because people like you stay to see them through, and comment below where you're watching from tonight, because we see you, and we're so glad you were here for every single step of it. And if this story stayed with you the way we hope it did, we think you're going to fall in love with the 2 full novels waiting for you right now, one that will break your heart, and one that will heal it completely. Both are ready for instant download, with a free audiobook included, the moment you tap the link in the description or the pinned comment. And if you're watching on your TV tonight, grab your phone, open the camera, and scan the QR code on your screen. Vivian's story ends here. But we have a feeling yours, tonight, is just getting started.